Hey, and welcome back to the Fantasy Football Profits. Today we're going to have some fun and we're going to break down the confusing Cleveland running back situation, as of course they've just signed running back Kareem Hunt a little while ago, and so we're going to talk about really who's going to be the guy there. Of course, Nick Chubb had a fantastic season. Kareem Hunt has been known since he came in the NFL as just an awesome running back, and really I guess the question that everybody has had on their mind is what kind of roles are these guys going to have and what is this going to mean for a fantasy perspective. So we want to have some fun today and do a pretty short video and just break down these two running backs and give you guys kind of our opinion of what we think it's going to look like in the middle of the season. Now, for those of you who haven't been on this channel before, this is not a sort of normal video for us to just break down just two players. And so if you guys like this video, of course, make sure to leave a comment down below and let us know that we should do more, and maybe even give us some suggestions. But let's not waste too much time and let's get right into it and just talk about some of the kind of statistics and some of the comparisons. Now, one thing to note before we go forward is that it's very confusing to figure out what's happening here because just before they signed Kareem Hunt, they had also given a 3-year contract to Duke Johnson. So that's very confusing. He was kind of the receiving back in that offense. And so, of course, now we're going to wonder what's happening with him. Many are speculating that there's going to be some sort of trading away of one of those 3 running backs. Personally, I don't think that that is too likely of an option, as we really haven't heard anything about it. And if that were likely to happen, there would be some news coming out. And so that could certainly happen going forward. It is a very long off season, but for now, I would say that's probably not going to happen. If it were to happen, I'd say the most likely would be Duke Johnson. I imagine what happened is they signed Duke Johnson as the receiving running back, knowing that they need to have some sort of balance and they need that sort of guy in their offense. And then they saw Kareem Hunt out there and they just couldn't pass up such a good opportunity to get such a prolific running back. And so they went out and got him, and now they've got 3 good running backs. So again, I would imagine they would get rid of Duke Johnson to a team who needs one, maybe like Baltimore. The second would be that they just picked up Kareem Hunt as a trade option, and they're going to try to trade him to a team like the Bears, as the Bears were the team that we really expected him to go to. Of course, that would be if the Bears and other teams would be willing to pay the price. However, I would be surprised to see if they had signed him for just I'd be very surprised to see that they signed him simply to trade him. But if that's the case, you would imagine that they would have some pre-planned, some pre-worked out deals and some idea of what was already going to happen. And of course, that means that some news would come out. The fact that we haven't heard anything says that probably isn't their intention. And then finally, possibly it's Nick Chubb. Maybe they're going to trade Nick Chubb away, although he really surprised them this year and stepped up, was a huge part of that offense, kept that ground game going, and really helped out. And so I don't necessarily think that he's going to be traded, but maybe they do. And the reason why I think that of all the guys he's the least likely to be traded is simply that he is probably, of those 3, the most pure of a runner, whereas Kareem Hunt can do a lot in the passing game and Duke Johnson does a load in the passing game. It was just a few seasons ago he went out and had 82 receptions, I believe it was. And so I'd be surprised to see them keep 2 pass-catching backs and get rid of their 1 pure runner. But we'll talk about those statistics later, because Kareem Hunt is a good running back. And I don't definitely want to put that down on him, but he's more dynamic in his ability to do both, whereas Nick Chubb is maybe more one-dimensional, but probably, I would say, as we've looked at the stats and really break it down, I would say Nick Chubb probably ends up being the better sole straight running back, sort of 90s style, where that's all you do is just get carries and get down the field as far as you can. Very physical and north-south runner. But let's not waste any time. We're going to start off by breaking these player statistics down individually, and then we're going to talk about them in comparison, and then we're going to do just a little bit of a roundup for this video. It should be pretty short. All right, so now we're going to talk about running back Kareem Hunt. And of course, before we talk about any of his statistics, it's important to note first and foremost that he played in just 11 games before being suspended. And so that's important to know. Of course, as we talk about these numbers, they would have been a lot higher. He had some very impressive stats. Over 1,200 all-purpose yards in just 11 games is very impressive. Of course, 14 touchdowns. We'll talk about what those touchdowns mean a little bit more later. But he was out there on 212 of the Chiefs running plays and took 181 carries for 824 yards as a solid 4.6 yards per carry. That's not quite elite, but that is above average, and that's solid numbers. He had 7 rushing touchdowns, which of course would have been higher if he had the extra 5 games. And then of course, your statistic we've been using a lot lately is yards after contact. And he did pretty good in that 3.35 average yards after contact. That is above average. That comes out to 606 of his total rushing yards were after contact. And of course, we talk about a running back projecting his statistics as he moves into a new role. How effective was he? A good way of measuring that is his ability to, create his own yards, like yards after contact, but also avoided tackles. 43 avoided tackles is very impressive in that time frame. In fact, he was on pace to finish with the most broken or avoided tackles in the NFL. And then talk about really another one is does this team trust him to make the plays and to get first downs? That level of trust is something that's very important. As much as one coach trusts you, it is possible for another coach to trust you. But if one team doesn't fully trust you to make the important plays, then why should anyone else? That oftentimes shows a weakness in a running back. And so I like that he went on. He had 46 first downs on the season. So Kareem Hunt, very effective in the running game, but also in the passing game. He only had 33 targets. That's not a whole lot. Even, for 11 games, which isn't much, that's still not a lot of targets, but he did take 26 of those. He caught 26 of those and went for 378 yards and 7 receiving touchdowns. So that comes out to about 78.8 catch percentage. Very impressive. Maybe even more impressive is the 14.5 yards per reception. And probably the most impressive of all. Now, of course, his quarterback was Pat Mahomes, but he generated a passer rating of 154 when he was targeted. Of course, a lot of that goes to Pat Mahomes and that offense and that scheme. Andy Reid is quite a genius there in Kansas City, but the fact that he was still able to live up to that scheme and not hold it back is absolutely huge. Those numbers are ridiculous. If he had played the full 15 seasons, he would have had 10 or 11, maybe even 12 receiving touchdowns. His numbers were insane, and so I love what Kareem Hunt was doing in the passing game. Now we're going to talk about Nick Chubb stats, and then we're going to talk about them in comparison a little bit, but I just wanted to roll through that fast as we talk about these guys. So we have just a general overview before we start to compare. So now here we are, Nick Chubb. Nick Chubb played in a full 16 games, but those numbers are very skewed. It took him until week 8 or week 7, I believe, one of those weeks, to finally break 3 carries a game. He had 2 or 3 carries every single game of the season until week 7 or week 8. I believe it was week 8, but for some reason I didn't write that down, which is a stupid mistake on my part. But that's beside the point. And yet he was very, very effective despite missing basically half the season. He was out there on 198 plays, or running plays I should say, and had 192 rushing attempts. So every time he was out there, it was running basically. And he went for 996 yards on an elite 5.2 yards per carry. And he went for 8 rushing touchdowns, which is good. But maybe even more impressive is his 858 yards after contact. That is 4.47 yards after contact. That is almost a full yard better than any other qualifying running back in the NFL. Now, what I mean by qualifying is running backs with enough carries to say that their statistics are normalized and that is a fair representation of who they are. 4.47 is insane. Again, to compare that, which we'll do a little bit more later, that is better than almost every other, better than every other qualifying running back in the NFL. Is insane. He went for an awesome 92-yard carry, which is always nice to see, always fun, those huge plays. But like I talked about earlier, avoided tackles is huge. Can he do it on his own in the yards after contact category? Yes, but can he avoid tackles as well? And that is very true with 44 avoided tackles. And then we talk about that trust, right? Those first downs. Can he make the plays that need to be made? Well, he did. He went for 48 first downs, and so he was very effective in the running game. In fact, when we look at these stats, he almost seems to be more effective than Kareem Hunt. But we'll talk about that in a little bit, because how do we look at these statistics? For him in the receiving game, he was almost non-existent. He had 28 targets for only 20 receptions and just 149 receiving yards. He did have 2 receiving touchdowns and a catching percentage of 71.4. But he only averaged 7.5 yards per catch, and that's not a whole lot. However, he did kind of make the most of what he had there, I suppose, with a generating a pass rating of 107.6. And so he wasn't amazing in the passing game, but part of that is maybe just down to the scheme, and so we'll kind of see what happens there. But I think it's clear right now as we start to go forward now, as we're going to compare these guys, is that they're definitely two different style running backs. And we're going to talk about how their style plays into their role. Well, if you've seen some of our other videos, you might know exactly what we think already. So I thought it'd be fun to throw in these graphs here and kind of compare them. When you look at total touchdowns, Kareem Hunt 14 touchdowns in just 11 games over the 10 by Nick Chubb. Of course, those numbers are a bit skewed when you really compare them because it took him forever to be the starting running back, and so that makes it interesting. I wanted to just remove all of the games that he played early on where he only had a few carries, but that numbers don't really work out because one of them he only had 3 carries, but he took one for a huge play, and that was part of his statistics. And then of course, 8 games of 3 carries really adds up for sure, and so I just left those in there. It's really hard to compare. Again, it's easy with a guy like Kareem Hunt to just say he only played 11 games and to not worry about those other games, but it's hard to compare a running back when they play partial games. That's very confusing. Anyways, let's look at some of these interesting stats that we have to kind of do to compare these guys to one another. So for starters, let's talk about the offense, right? What are kind of their getting help on that offense as a whole? Is their run game, is their run blocking doing to boost their statistics? Well, Nick Chubb actually had the better run blocking offensive line. They scored a 90.2 on Pro Football Focus's run blocking grade. That is one of the best in the NFL. However, the Chiefs didn't do too bad either. They had a 84.8, I believe that's top 10 in the NFL, if I'm not mistaken, though I could be. And so that was also a very good number. In fact, they are very good run blocking offenses. But again, edge goes there to Nick Chubb on that. Of course, that's not necessarily a benefit because that says maybe it's not entirely Nick Chubb. We'd be curious to see if Hunt will get a bit of a statistics boost when he moves over. But let's talk about some other stats. Keeping that in mind, that slight edge, that's more of a tiebreaker. I don't think that means a whole lot because the numbers are fairly similar, but I do like to throw that out there, of course, just for the sake of wholeness and thoroughness and for transparency as we move forward. Now, let's talk about one of the key stats that every fantasy owner likes to look at when they're talking about their running backs, and that's yards per carry or yards per attempt. Now, Nick Chubb went for 5.2 and Kareem Hunt went for 4.6. That is a 0.6 yard per carry difference. That's a huge difference. And Nick Chubb, hands down, wins that battle, of course. And then, of course, as we talked about earlier, we also got to talk about yards after contact on average. Of course, Hunt went for 3.35 and Chubb went for 4.47. So over a whole yard better, I believe that is 1.12 yards better. Absolutely crushed him, blew him out of the water. Nick Chubb in some of those statistics definitely seem to be better. Now here's where it gets a little bit different. They essentially tied on the avoided tackles. 44 and 43 respectively is essentially the same for us. Of course, just a stat keeping error could even that up pretty easily. And then first downs, 48 and 46. And so really the only notable differences between these two running backs are their yards per carry and their yards after contact, which surprisingly, I think a lot of people will be shocked to see Nick Chubb was actually better in that area. And then we talk about in the passing game, kind of the roles flip where Nick Chubb is a lot worse. Kareem Hunt went out there and had a generated a passer rating of 43 points better. So absolutely destroyed him in that area. He doubled his yards per reception from 7.5 to 14.5. From 149 yards Nick Chubb had in the receiving game, Kareem Hunt had 378. He took Chubb's 2 receiving touchdowns, and he actually had 7 receiving touchdowns. Absolutely crushed him. It's very clear to me when we look at these statistics, Nick Chubb is the better, more physical north-south runner. As I talked about earlier, he reminds me of a lot of those 90s and early 2000s running backs that didn't know how to do anything but run the ball, but they could hit you hard and they'd keep moving, and they were good running backs, but they didn't do much in the passing game. Whereas Kareem Hunt is really starting to be the NFL of today, where he can run very effectively, yes, but he also does a lot in the passing game. He's a dual threat, and when he's on the field, the defense has to be able to man him up and to be able to stop the run at the same time, knowing that he can do anything. And so they were both very impressive in their statistics. Chubb was a little bit lacking in the passing game, though that might be due to scheme. And of course, Hunt is a little bit lacking doing the running game. He was good compared to most running backs, but he was statistically worse than Chubb. One thing I'd be curious to see, of course, is this offseason as we go forward, kind of how does Hunt play as he works into that Cleveland system. Maybe he does separate himself as the lead back, but one thing I'm expecting right now is to see Nick Chubb get more carries and Kareem Hunt to get more in the passing game. But one great way to compare them is to compare them to their backups, right? How do their backups compare? That is a very interesting stat, because if one backup is awful or one backup is really good, that tells us how much it is on the offensive system and scheme or how much it is on the individual player. So here's a few key statistics from their respective backups. Now, as we look at it going forward, I've got it pulled up here on the screen. So we see yards after contact. We see Chubb's backup, Duke Johnson, had a very good 4.13. That is also very high with Nick Chubb's 4.47. And so that is very interesting to see that they both managed that for whatever reason. That suggests that the Browns are getting their running backs into open field and stopping them from being hit until they're further downfield, giving them more momentum. So that is a very key thing to look at, and that would make sense with a run blocking rating of 90.2. And then Kareem Hunt's backup had just, as Damian Williams, I believe it is, had just 2.26 yards after contact. That is a lot lower, over a whole yard lower than Hunt's 3.35. And so that's very interesting. Duke Johnson had 5 yards per carry. That's 0.2 worse than Chubb. But interestingly, Kareem Hunt's backup, Damian Williams, had 0.3 extra yards or more yards per carry. And so he was actually more effective in that aspect. I don't know what that contributes itself to. As we looked into some of the statistics, I thought maybe the run blocking played better, the offensive line played better, but it didn't seem to be that way. Maybe that's just not what Kareem Hunt does. Maybe he struggles a little bit physically in his ability to do that. Now, interestingly enough, the touchdowns, this was absolutely insane. When we compare the touchdowns, Kareem Hunt had 14 to Nick Chubb's 10, and that seemed to be the one area that he had a huge advantage in. But sure enough, look at it, Duke Johnson had 0 and Damian Williams had 6. That would suggest that all those touchdowns by those Chiefs running backs are part of this scheme, that they were simply getting more opportunities and chances to find the end zone, and that the Cleveland running backs weren't having quite as many. So one thing that would suggest is that there's going to be a major drop-off in Kareem Hunt's touchdowns this season, not only because he's going to be forced to split carries and time on the field, but also because possibly he's going to get less chances. However, that offense is going to get better. Rookie quarterback Baker Mayfield, who actually set a rookie record with 27 passing touchdowns, he's going to improve. He's going to feel more comfortable and more mature this season, and I think that offense is going to move the ball a bit better, especially when you look at the fact that they have a better new coaching staff. Hugh Jackson is finally gone, and that should mean a lot. Of course, after he left, that entire offense and that team as a whole played much, much better. Now, one thing to talk about here is, again, I think those backups their statistics aren't huge signs because of they're just different players. But again, I think that Kareem Hunt's backup simply did better than Nick Chubb's backup. And again, that would suggest that Kareem Hunt was a bit of a product of that offense, and Nick Chubb maybe a little bit less, a little bit more independently good, whatever that would mean. Don't overthink it too much though, guys. Let's just close this video out here and talk about these guys for a few more minutes. Now, there's so much time in this off season. Coach preference, you get in the guy's doghouse, right? If Kareem Hunt shows up and he just is a little bit lazy for a day, he can get in the coach's doghouse and he could easily be the backup, right? He could easily see half as much time as Chubb, and Chubb could dominate that offense as the main back. But I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case. I do want to clarify that because we're making this video so early that I kind of looked at the statistics, and it's been conclusive, really, almost inarguable, that Nick Chubb is the better sole running back, the better north-south physical guy, but that really what the Browns are looking for is that guy in the passing game, is that dynamic running back that can do both and keep defenses on their toes, which is a little bit more of what Kareem Hunt does. That is undeniable, but again, wanted to say, you know, those statistics, while we can't argue those, and I think they're pretty solid and pretty firm, there's a lot to happen in this offseason, maybe an injury, or maybe some news comes out, or maybe whatever could happen. And so that's certainly going to change a lot going forward. Again, just wanted to clarify that. And of course, guys, I would love to hear what you guys have to say on it. One thing that we don't get to do a lot on this channel is breaking down player film. Now, of course, I do that on my own by watching film and doing it to study guys and research guys, but it's hard for us to display the film and say, okay, well, he had this nice carry outside the tackles and he dodged this guy, and like, it just doesn't sound good, doesn't work for what we're doing here. But of course, I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about these guys, both statistically and on film. I'd love to talk to you guys that quite a bit. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. You have a great day, and God bless.